We just need to take as a given an assumed breach. And now it's how do we best identify what they're doing, what they're looking at, what they're targeting. And that's where I find that canaries are a very good component into that program, especially today as we move more and more into cloud environments, microservices, container type architectures.
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm the CEO, co-founder of TraceBit, here to talk about security, canaries, deception, and the like. I'm very excited to be joined by Mandy today, who I'll let introduce herself just now.
Thanks, Andy. Happy to be here. Mandy Andress. I am the CISO at Elastic.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Mandy. Very excited to have you here today. I guess, first things first, in terms of how we know each other, how we work together, anything you think worth flagging or bringing up?
Yeah, just to make sure everything is transparent. I, as an individual, am an investor in TraceBit, and in my role as CISO at Elastic. We are not, as a company, a customer of TraceBit. So what I'm talking about is my opinions and my perspectives on TraceBit and canaries in general.
Brilliant. So let's jump into it. Would love to hear a little bit about, I guess, set the scene, your experiences with, views on, or journey with deception, honeypots, security, canaries. Would just love to hear about how that's kind of evolved over your career.
Yeah, my initial kind of foray into deception was in the kind of early 2000 when honeypots, honeynets were the talk of the industry, and just really getting at that time an understanding of kind of what the power of deception could bring and how that's evolved. And then, when I take a step back and look more broadly at deception and, a lot of questions on honeypots versus canaries versus deception, I look at kind of deception as the broad umbrella of things that you can do. Honeypots more in the, let me trap someone, let me trap a threat actor so I can monitor their behavior, see what they're trying, give them something that looks really interesting so you can also slow them down a bit and have more time on your side from a defense perspective to take some action and implement more controls or whatever you need to do in your environment. Where canaries, I look more on the being able to identify very high fidelity alerts and evidence that something is happening in your environment that you don't expect or don't ever need to see happen. And so it gives you some very high quality information that, hey, someone accessed this file, used this account, whatever the canary is, and tells you that I need to go investigate that immediately. And sometimes it could be an insider moving around, just an employee just trying to see what's out there, or it could be evidence that there is a threat actor, malicious, whether insider or external threat actor that's in your environment, and it gives you that very, very specific action that you can then go investigate, and it gives you a starting point, and then you can move from there.
Brilliant. I think that's a very good way of splitting it up. And yes, on our side, we've been focused initially on that security canary side of the picture. Is there for you like a preference? Is there one approach you think is better than the other? One that you go to first?
I think that they're two very different objectives. So for me, I like to start with canaries because my goal in leading security programs in organizations is to protect the organization. So first and foremost, I want as many ways as possible to identify and understand if there's something occurring in the environment that shouldn't be. And I find and have found for a long time that canaries are a really effective way to do that. Then more if I just want to learn about what's happening in the environmental. Honeypots are interesting and can give you some really interesting insights. But my first and foremost priority is always protecting the organization that I am working with in their security program.
And I think we are seeing quite often when we have conversations about deception, security canaries, honeypots, the term assume breach coming up very often, which is this idea that you should take actions on the assumption that attackers are in your systems already, and work to detect them. Is that something you believe in, and do you think canaries are a big part of that picture?
Absolutely. So I started in security back in the days when having a breach was bad, and while it's not a good thing today, it's much more understood that they're going to happen. They are happening, and building out security postures, building out security programs with assumed breach as the foundational element. With nation states and a number of highly sophisticated threat actors, they're going to be in our environments, and that we just need to take as a given an assumed breach. And now it's how do we best identify what they're doing, what they're looking at, what they're targeting. And that's where I find that canaries are a very good uh, component into that program, especially today as we move more and more into cloud environments, microservices, container type architectures. You have a lot of kind of API keys, access tokens as access, or even accounts. And kind of the top entry point for attackers today is in leaked credentials that they're able to use. And from a traditional detection and monitoring perspective, that looks like a potentially valid use of that account. Only when you really start looking at behavior analytics of an account and you see it might be doing things differently than it has in the past, do you get any insight that, hey, something odd is going on here that I need to investigate. Where with canaries, if you have something that triggers, you know that that only triggers if something's happening that I don't expect. And so you know immediately that that's a high priority investigation. And so it really helps reduce the time between identifying or someone getting into your environment and identifying that there's activity that you need to investigate versus with canaries getting that really, yes, I know I don't want to see this, so let me go take a look.
Amazing. Yep, I completely agree. It makes total sense. Uh, I'd love to jump to if there is any times you can share when you've put canaries into practice. Any stories you can tell there? You're really interested to hear.
Yeah, I've put in, certainly this is a number of years ago, things as simple as putting a file in a file share on a production server that is a targeted, whether it's an application, a targeted environment for data, and kind of have this canary file hanging out there that looks enticing. It's always good to name a file passwords and see who opens it to see what's happening. And so canaries don't have to be complex. They're as simple as whether it's an account that you have in your environment that really should never be used. So if it is, it means someone's taken it over, and you should look at that. If it's a file, if it's even just a key around, and if that gets access, just anything in your environment that is important to your organization, finding a way to look at that overall infrastructure and architecture and see what can I put in here that someone can access, can do, can even take a look at or open, that gives you some type of insight that something's happening that you aren't expecting or don't want to see.
Nice. And when you've done this yourself, are there detections you've made, and is that necessary for you to think that's a successful program, or can you be successful in canaries without actually detecting anything at all?
And for me, so putting the canary in place and then creating an associated detection rule within your kind of overall detection and monitoring space, is what gives you the alert that something has triggered. And we test to make sure that they do trigger. And at times we're doing red team exercises that'll be part of the objectives, again, as part of the test, just to make sure, one, if they get there, then and we get the alert so we understand that our canaries are working as intended. And the fact that then understanding how, from a red team perspective, they were able to whether get through layers of controls, because theoretically your canaries are something that's not easily accessible. It's something that is harder. So that someone's had to go through a number of steps or worked through some layers of controls before they were able to trigger that canary.
Nice. So it doesn't actually need to be a compromise, but you do want to do some validation of that with like a red team or manual testing. And from your experience deploying these yourselves in your teams, any lessons learned, any things you do differently or ways you'd approach it differently based on your experience?
I think, for me, I think canaries need to be a much larger component of a program from a detection and monitoring space. And as I look at just environments are becoming more and more complex. As I mentioned before, threat actors today, they're getting in through leaked credentials. And so it's really hard to understand what is approved behavior and what is anomalous behavior unless you have some really detailed behavior analytics that's happening in your environment. And with canaries, it's a very low cost, high fidelity way to just understand that there is something being accessed or something being triggered in your environment that you should never see. So we talk a lot about making sure security programs really understand what are the core components and what are the critical components of a business and its success. And if you take that as core of building out an overall security posture, putting canaries in places where you don't want to see triggers is a really low cost way to have an effective program.
Interesting. So do more of it is your learnings. Uh, I guess on that subject, I think it's probably fair to say that in the industry today, that probably isn't like a default for security teams. Is that kind of a preconception that you come across when you're talking to teams about this? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. And I don't have a good reason as to why. I think sometimes it's actually too simple. We've come to think that security needs to be complex, it needs to be hard, it needs to be expensive, and you can have a very robust canary program that's the exact opposite. It's very effective, very powerful, very inexpensive. So I think that's part of it, just how we're conditioned to look at security. And I think another aspect is that it makes you, going back to, you really need to understand your organization, how it operates, and what's critical. And that's not always something that security programs have an in-depth understanding of. And so there's not taking the time. They may know, this is a critical business application and has some controls around it, but really understanding how that application operates and understanding the individual components and how those components work together to say, hey, if I ever see this happening, or putting a couple stages of canaries in a business critical app chain, it takes a lot more focus and in-depth understanding that I think a lot of security teams today just don't necessarily have the time to get into and understand that detailed insight.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. How do you think that could change in the future? Like, what do you think is going to encourage people to change their views on this? Aside from us two talking about it being a great idea.
I think, the more we're talking about it, so I think it's awesome that you're having these sessions. I think certainly what Tracebit is doing in making it, focusing canaries in the cloud. And it's a newer space that I think even less folks thinking about using canaries in their cloud environments. And then having it easy, very easy to deploy and manage. I think some of it's also just managing an inventory of canaries. Having a handful is pretty easy to keep track of, but if you get into a much larger inventory of canaries, how do you remember where they all are and what they should be doing and how you should be adjusting them? You need to manage them just like you need to manage detection rules and anything else in your environment. So I think platforms like what Tracebit is building is helpful as well, because it gives you that centralized place to manage, deploy, and understand what canaries you have and what some options are for additional ones to consider.
Nice. Yeah, I think to go slightly to pitching the product, we definitely do think the cloud does make it different, right? There's the things that make people productive and effective and make the cloud scalable also just apply just as well to canaries. These lightweight serverless resources, for example, are very, very suitable for scaling these things out across your entire org versus previous approaches, which spinning up a server into every single network you have is probably financially and operationally untenable, but creating an S3 bucket in every AWS account, as an example, it's probably something that you could do tomorrow quite easily.
It's a great example.
And then I guess on the kind of the subject we kind of were leaning into about measuring success, when you're talking to leadership, maybe like outside of the security function, how do you talk about the return on investment for doing something like canaries? Is it different from other security work, or how do you think about it?
I wouldn't say it's different. I talk about it as a component of a program. It's one piece of an overall detection and monitoring picture to help ensure, as a security practitioner, my biggest concern and the thing that keeps me up at night is, what do I not know? And certainly false negative concerns when it comes to kind of traditional SIM and detection rules. And I look at canaries as a bit of a catch. If something falls through on the detection front and kind of traditional SIM detections, then we have canaries as a fallback. If something gets accessed or triggered or used, then we have another layer of a detection that helps us. But what I think moving forward, and I mentioned a little bit, just complexity, scale, speed, both of environments and threat actors. We haven't mentioned AI, so of course we can't have a conversation today without mentioning AI. But just I think the speed and additional capabilities that will bring in the future, it's near impossible today, but it'll be even harder for environments and security teams to create kind of detection rules and traditional detection rules that find everything. We can't always anticipate what it is. So moving much more to a behavior analytics approach, but that takes training and that takes timing. And so I see successful programs in the future being more of a combination of behavior analytics, canary detections to get those high fidelity alerts that need immediate investigation, and then much less focus on what we think about today as traditional SIM and traditional detections. I still have some, but we won't be able to scale and we won't be able to be as effective as we should be, given the nature of how everything's changing and evolving in the needs for security programs today.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that AI point as well. I was having this conversation with someone recently, and I think the other AI point that I think security teams is very front of mind for them at the moment is just the rate of development as well on the the internally rather than like the threat actor side, and the fact that less skilled individuals or even non-software engineers maybe shipping to production in the now or in the not too distant future. Like, where does that sit on the scale for you, like alongside the AI-enabled threat actors who are faster and more efficient?
Absolutely. I think it's both more development, but also more people being able to develop. The bar of entry is significantly lowered from a development perspective. If you look at things like Cursor and the ability to create a working application, potentially with minimal to no coding knowledge. And so I think that we'll just continue to see an expansion of applications that, at least in the near term, are created and put into production with a number of vulnerabilities. Still working out how to get tools like Cursor to write code that does not include a number of security vulnerabilities. So I think, from my perspective, it'll get worse before it gets better. And a concept of vulnerable applications and things that have the ability to get exploited. And so, as you anticipate that from a security practitioner perspective, how do you think about what are the best ways that you can get some type of insight that something's happening in your environment, and then tying all those pieces together? And so I think it's really good from a speed of development perspective. I think we'll have a little bit of a hard time on the security front for a little while, but then we'll figure it out.
And I guess the other kind of AI pillar then is like the agents kind of running riot through our environments that we're building. And I think that is actually starting to happen now. I don't know if anyone's kind of letting agents like loose into their public cloud production infrastructures and just seeing what's happens yet. But you can totally imagine that in the not too distant future. Is that a concern? Is that something you see canaries telling a good story for?
I do. I think we're certainly in the very early stages of AI agents, but they will explode very, very quickly. And there's a number of challenges then that on just how to manage, how do you know what they're doing, how do you know what they're accessing, the potential capability for them to go rogue. And that's where I think canaries can also play a role, and you can put some triggers in place. And as I talked about, what's critical for the company, looking at an agent, and an agent has a role, and really trying to anticipate, well, what are the guardrails for that agent, and what would it start to do if for us to think that it's going rogue, and then putting some canaries kind of in those guardrails to be able to have triggers and get visibility to help ensure that your AI agents continue to operate as you expect. Otherwise, it's again, you're back to behavior analytics, but sometimes you want some much more real time, very high fidelity alerts that give you the insights to go investigate immediately. So I think that's a new space as well for a focus for
Amazing. Yeah, and I think on our side, I couldn't say we've seen any interesting agent detections so far, but we've certainly seen many human detections that I can see being completely transferable. For example, an engineer in quick succession reading a number of canary secrets in a production environment, which you probably wouldn't have a detection for if they were non-canary secrets, because that could be expected behavior. And the beauty of that canary detection is that they should not read those secrets, and you can investigate and see if they've been compromised, or have a conversation with them. And I can see that being very easily translatable to an agent, where you didn't expect the agent to go and read every single database password in your production environment when you asked it to go and check some database analytics or something like that, and it has tried to. And those sorts of detections I see being pretty transferable to kind of setting boundaries around your expected behavior for those systems.
Absolutely.
Amazing. I guess onto a kind of like broader advice for a canary program, and more like practical pieces. Would you communicate to your wider organization and team about that you're doing this practice? Like, where do you stand on that? Would you tell them that you're doing something deceptive for canaries? Would you tell them where it is? Would you tell them what to do if they were to find some?
Certainly wouldn't tell folks beyond who needs to know where the canaries are located. If we're looking at them to be critical alert points for us, that's something that we need to keep pretty tight, and not certainly not have public, but certainly limit access within the organization. Don't hide talking about that we use canaries in general as a core part of a program, or to kind of the future of a program. And just understanding, some of it is you never know where a canary is. So some of it's a bit of prevention, of just, hey, do my job and not poke around and see what else is there, and I might accidentally trigger something. But also letting folks know that you have a robust security program. As we talked about before, canaries aren't something that are really looked at as a standard component of a program, even though I think they should be. So just getting into that picture of, I have layers of detection, canaries are a part of that, also helps send a signal that you've got a pretty mature, pretty strong security program in place if you're looking at detection from multiple layers. So while not sharing specific canaries, the fact that we talk about, we use them, we have them as a key part of our program, that provides some insight onto the type of security focus the company has.
And do you think, I'm thinking from someone, the benign positive detection, someone accidentally stumbles upon one of these things, they're doing their job, it's not something intentional, but they just happen to, it might be rare, but it's possible. What I think sometimes we hear is, concerns. There's, for some reason, there's a block in people's heads, or there's something different psychologically about a detection rule that they've built that would detect someone doing some behavior, versus the fact that you place something there that they kind of, they put their hand in a mousetrap, and you catch them. There seems to be a psychological difference. Like, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, from that perspective, I think it's similar to fish testing, a bit of the gotcha mentality. So I think, yes, it can happen. From my perspective on canaries, if it does happen and someone doing their job triggers it, then from a security team perspective, that leads me to we need to rethink that canary. We want canaries in place that ideally aren't getting triggered by folks doing their standard job and their standard roles, but also ensuring that the response that we have within the investigation of the trigger of that canary is we also go into that investigation not with at least with an insider, just being mindful that it could be a false positive. And so part of it's just how that investigation and how that communication is happening within your organization with the security team and that individual. It also plays a key role in just how that perception is built within the company, and then how it can spread based on that overall response process.
Good. Yeah, makes excellent sense. I completely agree. I'm interested if you were to give a security practitioner, leader, like one piece of advice about security canaries, about getting started with them, like today, what would you say?
I would say get started. They are extremely easy to implement, and it's very straightforward. And it doesn't have to be anything over complex. You shared just open an S3 buckets in all of your AWS accounts. That bucket should never be accessed. So have an alert that if it does, something to investigate. It's not, and you can do that with anything, whether it's files, whether it's accounts, whether it's keys. So just get started, put them in production environments, put them in critical places. And then you'll start to understand the power of canaries a bit more and start to think about more complex ways that you could take advantage of them.
Amazing. And then I guess finally for me, where do you see deception, canaries, deception technology, honeypots, etc.? Where do you see them heading in the future? What do you see? How do you see the future of this technology and this approach?
I can't say I have a specific future. I think the addition of AI into the space is going to change it. I think there's some really interesting deception things that we would be able to do with AI as that becomes more prevalent in environments. We talked about agents going rogue. In honeypots, are there honey agents where you can trick someone into engaging with an agent? They think they're having actions performed across their environments where they're actually just engaging with a honey agent. So I think there's some really cool deception approaches that will evolve out of all the new technology that we're seeing come online today.
Awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you very much for your time, Mandy. That was brilliant. Really appreciate it.